Zack Polanski's Green Party comfortably won the Gorton and Denton by-election in Manchester on Thursday with a Camp of the Saints-esque promise to steal from white people and give their stuff to immigrants. He's running a Zoran Mandani-style campaign, and very successfully, I might add, because the Green Party are now consistently polling in at third. They have cannibalised Labour's vote share, cutting it down by half since the 2024 election, and stealing a Labour seat that's been safely red for over a century. But the second place contender was Reform UK. It was Matt Goodwin, who I've known for a few years and previously said on this channel I thought he would make a good MP because he seemed to be on the right wing of reform, talking about how Brits were going to become a minority in their own country by 2063. He was the progenitor of the research that gave us that looming deadline. And also saying that you're not necessarily British just because you were born here and had a passport. So it seemed that Matt Goodwin was the nativist candidate for the stand-in for a nativist party. Except Matt decided to play sectarian politics, just not with the native British people, you know, his actual constituents. And so the lesson here is that all voting going forward will be ethnic and sectarian, whether we like it or not. And I don't, but unfortunately, because of mass migration, because of multicultural accommodation, because there are ethnic and religious colonies up and down our country who do form successful voting blocs, if we don't engage in an identity politics which authentically represents the British people, whose way of life and possession of their own country is under threat, then we will lose. Because we're not fighting a battle on the same terms as our enemy here. The enemy is very explicit. The Green Party ran local plumber, clean energy technician, Hannah Spencer, and I don't think it was her unbelievable charisma or even her Bollywood dance moves that won her the vote. It was the fact that the Green Party embraced the fact they are now the party of immigrants and delusional progressives who want to open the borders and legalise all drugs. And they're shameless about doing so. They don't pretend to be otherwise, and this is why they have attracted so much support. Whereas every other party, Reform, Labour, the Conservatives, will complain about this sectarian voting but do nothing about it, because they're all various flavours and colours of the same liberal centrist consensus that was set up by Tony Blair, who allowed these people into the country in the first place, and hope to build a state that forces all of them to get along, and are therefore unwilling to admit that there are irreconcilable tensions and contradictions between these voting blocs. So, as we can see in the polling ahead of the election, the white British vote was voting 41% for reform. The ethnic minority vote, 8% for reform. 37% for the Greens, 36% for Labour. And then the white British vote was voting 23%, for the Greens and 22% for Labour. So all of the insistence that reform could make inroads to the Muslim community, or Sikhs and Hindus, because even though they don't want to admit it, Sikhs and Hindus don't like Muslims very much, so they're happy to lean into sectarian tensions in the Indian subcontinent when it benefits them, they just don't want to say it. For all of those overtures made to minority groups, reform didn't make the inroads that they needed in order to win. They were just unwilling to commit to being the party for the white British majority. Whereas the Greens successfully pandered to the minority vote, coalesced them as a block vote, and walked away with it. And this was admitted by Sky News, as Nick Dixon captions here. The station is just casually admitting that voting is now an ethnic battle and democracy as we know it is over. And that's because the pre-political we, as Roger Scruton says, has been fractured. You have to define who your constituency are before you seek to represent their interests on matters like infrastructure or energy or the economy. And if we can't define who we are, and Reform UK certainly can't, then they can't represent them. The Greens know who they are. They're the party of demented progressives and immigrants who want to take white people's stuff. They're not shy about that. And it turns out that Gorton is a kind of mini Gaza, where Pakistanis and Bangladeshis live, barely speaking English, in sequestered communities, surrounded by the liberal handmaidens who bring them in out of suicidal empathy. Whereas the Denton side of the constituency are white Brits who have to live in a kind of Israel-style border town with this colony right next to them, and are crying out for authentic representation, but Reform have nailed their colours to the mast and said they're unwilling to do that.
Look at this. This is how Gorton and Denton split down by ethnic minority. And you can see in one part, there is a large South Asian community in the sort of Gorton heart, whereas the Denton part is almost overwhelmingly white. And I think most Reform people would say that they were trying to mine voters in this part of the constituency. But here, I think this has largely been a battle between Labour and the Greens.
And this is why Reform's electoral strategy was always doomed to fail, because they weren't willing to say that they were focusing on the Denton part, and they were trying to make inroads in the Gorton part, whereas the Green Party were just saying, we're the party of Gorton, we're the party of Pakistan and Bangladesh, we're the party of Islam and colonization. Vote for us if you want more free stuff from white people. And it turns out that lots of people from those communities want that, and so they voted Green, whereas Reform don't like the fact that their own voter base say, we don't want immigrants taking our stuff, we'd actually like the immigrants to go home, thank you very much. And the parties that fail to recognise that this is the future will continue to lose. So Keir Starmer put out a letter in the immediate aftermath of the election result. As you can see here, the turnout was only 47.5%, so that means that plenty of people stayed home, and I would wager that this is in the Denton side rather than the Gorton side, because the white working class in Denton didn't feel they had authentic representation after Labour abandoned them to become the party of immigrants, and then the immigrants abandoned Labour to the Green Party because the Green Party said we're even more a party of immigrants. But Keir Starmer said that the Greens are practising a divisive and sectarian form of politics, and that they're not the harmless environmentalists they pretend to be. They don't even pretend to be harmless environmentalists anymore. Like, Zack Polanski was reading out poetry that described Britain as an incoherent concoction of every ethnicity on the earth, except the native ethnicities of our isles, the English, Welsh, the Scottish and the Irish. The Green Party explicitly say that Britain belongs to everyone but the British, whereas, as Labour's own MP Clive Lewis pointed out, saying that Keir Starmer was caretaker Prime Minister whose days are numbered, Labour are trying to straddle both sides of the fence. Starmer declares that we're an island of strangers, and also that Britain has always been diverse and that diversity is our strength. Like, you can't pick a lane. You can never appease two masters. And the Conservatives have done the same. Kemi Badenoch has written this letter saying, Labour created the monster of harvesting Muslim community block votes, and yesterday that monster came back to bite them. As I've said before, we are a multiracial country, not a multicultural country. If you stir up grievance politics between groups based on religion or race, as Labour have done for decades, as Reform are seeking to do, and as the Greens have done successfully in this by-election, you are pitting neighbours against each other, and you start to unravel the culture of tolerance that makes Britain great. All of this is based on a false premise. First of all, many of these people will have been brought here by the Conservatives. Not just by Boris Johnson, of course, as part of the Boris wave, but by David Cameron, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak, and because of the policies that Kemi Badenoch campaigned for. Remember, in 2018, she called for the abolition of caps on student and work visas. So the policies that led to the Boris wave were the policies that Kemi Badenoch herself suggested in Parliament. So just bringing these people here causes ethnic and sectarian block voting. But she operates under the delusion that these people are neighbours. And as we've seen, Gorton and Denton are not neighbours. They are essentially two colonies next to each other, one of native Brits and one of resentful immigrants. And the native Brits never wanted the resentful immigrants here in the first place. It's like saying that two countries that fundamentally hate each other are neighbours. Like, in any real relational sense, are Israel and Palestine neighbours? Are North and South Korea neighbours, Kemi? No. They resent one another. And so the idea that fomenting ethnic sectarianism is something that the Green Party are doing to a community, rather than capitalising on it already existing organically in the community as a product of importing a foreign community into a domestic community, is laughable. These people weren't neighbours before the Green Party came along. The Green Party just saw the opportunity and successfully capitalised on it where all other parties refused to do so. There is no ability for the state to force all these people to get along, because they have irreconcilable worldviews, irreconcilable ways of life, and one belongs here and one doesn't. But you're unwilling to admit that, because of course that would be mean. But the most laughable party in this is Reform. They've been complaining about family voting, a practice which is common in the Muslim community, as is postal voting, because husbands will vote on behalf of their wives, and so they will shepherd their wives to the polling booths, look over their shoulder, and ensure that they're voting for the same candidate. And the insinuation here is women don't have a choice, they're not free and rational agents in these subcontinental Muslim communities, and that this is frowned upon by our Western liberal feminist democracy. And this is a position that Reform themselves hold. And so Zia Yusuf says, it's not family voting, it's illegal coercion, and it will not be tolerated under a Reform government. Now, it is true that the poll watchers at Gorton and Denton saw large amounts of family voting, much more than in previous elections and other by-elections. But is it that the Green Party are strong-arming Muslims into family voting? Or is it this is just the organic cultural practice of these communities, and a party came along and promised to prioritise their interests over the interests of the natives, and so they just said, why don't we just all vote Green? And because this is how I run my household, with my wife being a kind of moon that orbits me, why don't I just force her to vote Green because we're all voting Green? But if she were to vote of her own accord, do you not think she'd also be voting Green? Because, and this is the thing that Dan Hodges pointed out, for context, Dan Hodges was the guy that Gwaine Towler, Nigel Farage's right-hand man in UKIP, went to in order to vet their candidates via communist group Hope Not Hate. But Dan Hodges says, is Reform's argument really that thousands of Muslim women in Gorton and Denton secretly love Keir Starmer, or were desperate to vote for Matt Goodwin, but were forced to vote Green by their husbands? Because the Green Party, as much as we despise what they stand for, were authentically a voice for the Muslim bloc vote. So even if Muslim women were allowed to vote without the supervision of their husbands, they'd still be authentically voting Green anyway. So there is a delusion by Reform, by Labour, and by the Conservatives that this is an effect of coercive control, or patriarchy, or artificial division injected into an otherwise unified Gorton and Denton community. No. These communities hold deep grudges for one another. One, because they never wanted to bring these people in here in the first place, and the other, because they hate white people and want to take their stuff. And the immigrant group is clearly the aggressor in this dynamic, because if left to our own devices, we'd be pretty peaceful as Brits. So the idea that without the artificial division of the Green Party, just noticing the fact that division exists, there would be no division, is ludicrous. And this is why Reform's reaction to the Gorton and Denton by-election has been laughable and shows that they won't learn their lesson. Farage posted on X yesterday that incidents of family voting in Gorton and Denton reached the highest levels of any election in the past 10 years, according to Sky News. This is deeply concerning and raises serious questions about the integrity of the democratic process in predominantly Muslim areas. As I pointed out below, I thought that if you alienated the Muslim vote, you would lose, Nigel. You were emphatic about this on Winston Marshall's show. We will lose. Reform will lose. The country will lose if you alienate the Muslim vote. Meaning that you are going out of your way to appease it, to court it, with the prospect that Reform could win Muslim voters over?
But the nub of it is, we have a Muslim population in Britain growing by about 75% every 10 years. Right? That's just where we are.
Mm-hmm.
If we politically alienate the whole of Islam, we will lose. We'll lose.
So how does one include
We
them?
will lose. By 2050, goodness knows what kind of a terrible state we're going to be in.
The desperation in Farage's voice there is actually shameful. How insistent he was to interrupt Winston Marshall pressing further. But I'll press further. What does winning look like then, Nigel? Which parts of the Quran and Hadiths are going to make their way into Reform's party platform? And how's that strategy working out for you? Because you did lose this election by about 5,000 votes, despite you making overtures to the Muslim community and Matt Goodwin making overtures to Sikhs and Hindus and Hong Kongers, while disavowing those who warned that doing so would disenfranchise your own nativist-minded working-class white British voters. I'm not joking about this, by the way. Ahead of the election, Farage was telling the Daily Express that Reform's strategy in Gorton and Denton was to target Muslim voters, and he said he thinks many Muslims will vote for him.
Woman who's going to stand for us for the Mayor of London contest against Sadiq Khan. So, no, there are plenty of members of the Muslim community who will vote for reform, support reform. The difference here, of course, is that for many, many years, the Muslim vote was viewed by Labour as being a block vote. They turned out and voted for Labour in their droves. That has changed a lot.
You're right, Nigel, it has changed a lot. Now they're a block vote for the Greens, who are an expressly Islamic party, who are promising to give vast amounts of patronage to Muslim communities, rather than seek to walk Labour's liberal Blairite tightrope of reconciling unalloyed support for Israel, as well as sympathy for Palestine and appeasement of Muslim communities. Instead, the Green Party are just thoroughly anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, but more specifically, as a threat for us here in Britain, anti-white, anti-British, and say, we're just going to take their stuff and give it to you guys. And it turns out that's a real vote winner among the Biradiri clans of the Indian subcontinent, because in clannish societies, you will lie, cheat, and steal to advantage yourself, your family, your clan, your ethnic group, and the ummah. And if you are engaging in individualistic politics when they are playing clannish politics, you will lose every time. But of course, Farage isn't actually engaging in individualistic politics because he's speaking about the Muslim community. So he recognises that it is a collective that Reform are interested in courting. So they're only willing to speak about foreign communities and courting their sectarian interests in a way that advantages them, even though it doesn't, but they aren't willing to speak the same way about the white British, who are nearing minority status in their own country, and therefore, as they realise the demographics and culture of their country are changing around them, are becoming a consolidated bloc, competing in a zero-sum game for resources and recognition with other imported groups. But they're the only ones that, at present, don't have a registered political party running in local elections speaking explicitly and primarily to their concerns. So that's why it was ridiculous when Matt Goodwin said, after losing the by-election, "We are losing our country. A dangerous Muslim sectarianism has emerged. We have only one general election left to save Britain. Vote Reform every chance you get. I will continue the fight. I will always fight for you. I will stand at the next general election. Matt." Okay, Reform, if they think that having a passport makes you British, which is something that David Ball said, throwing Matt Goodwin under the bus after this election, we'll get onto that in a moment. If they really think that demographic change is not their concern, something Nigel Farage has said, something Richard Tice has said, if they really think that immigrants can become the heirs to English culture and our civilization, as Danny Kruger has said, if they really believe that our identity is so plastic and just a result of how you feel, as Farage said on the BBC, then why do we have only one election left? Can all of these immigrants not just be convinced to change their minds and vote Reform at the next election? If demographics aren't a problem for Reform UK, then why do we only have one election left? Because I'm sure you can convince all these Muslim voters to eventually vote Reform, right? No. They acknowledge that there is a Muslim sectarian vote. They acknowledge that demographic change results in cultural change and can ethnically gerrymander a democratic electoral system. But they complain about it and don't do anything about it. They won't promise to strip citizenships from these people. They won't promise to ban foreigners voting in elections, all things that Restore Britain have already promised. And they won't, in the elections themselves, specifically represent the white British majority as a voting bloc. Unlike every other party, including Reform, who will pander to sectarian concerns. So it's all well and good for Matt Goodwin to say the British people must reject sectarianism, it's dangerous, it's anti-democratic, it's un-British. But the Muslims aren't British. You know this, Matt. You said the 7/7 bombers aren't British. Axel Rudakabana isn't British. Just because they have a British passport and were born in Britain does not make them British. Likewise, the Green Party's Muslim voters are not British. They're largely Pakistani or Bengali. And therefore, are you saying they aren't British if they're doing something un-British? Or is it Reform's party line that these people are British, despite being Pakistani, Bengali, Muslim immigrants, and they just haven't been persuaded by Reform's offers to cut tax rates or slash alcohol duty, or Lee Anderson's posts about eating fish and chips and a bacon sandwich? Some of those things, might rub the Muslim community up the wrong way. But hang on a minute, I thought they were British, therefore they shouldn't have a problem with that, right? It's entirely incoherent. And it's also incoherent because Matt did not reject sectarian voting while he was campaigning. He just rejected it for the white British. Because, if you remember, Matt had a bust-up with Restore Britain because, unprovoked, he attacked friends he has in that party by saying, British Sikhs have done more than most to take on the grooming gangs. See my previous video on how they took on the grooming gangs for Sikhs and were allowed to do so because they were allowed to organise along ethnic and religious lines, whereas the white British weren't allowed to do that. And anytime a dad tried to rescue his daughter from a rape gang den, the police turned up and arrested him or his daughter as a child prostitute, which doesn't exist, instead. Because, turns out, the police were involved in the gangs. Anyway, Matt said, they have done more to help me win a Labour fiefdom than a lot of so-called patriots who stood rival candidates and enabled the left. I do not like the blatant racism that surrounds pro-Restore accounts. So it's fine to pander to Sikhs, but it's not fine to say we represent the interests of the native British majority. That doesn't mean you have to be mean to people of other extractions, but it does mean that we deserve a party that represents our interests, and that actually it's the method of electoral success in an age of the Green Party overtly and successfully pandering to minority, imported, racial and religious grievance group interests. And the thing is, when Matt said that these people were doing more than patriots to help him campaign and win a safe Labour seat, that's just not true, and it was always doomed to fail. Here's a breakdown of the religious demographics in Gorton and Denton, provided by the Henry Jackson Society. And the Henry Jackson Society was founded by Alan Mendoza, who's currently Reform's foreign policy advisor. So, they should have known this ahead of time. As you can see here, the sum total of non-Muslim and non-white British voters, so I'm counting in non-white British, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jews, and others. I'm gonna, for sake of argument, say that Christians and none are predominantly white British. I mean, there will be some who aren't, but for sake of argument, the overall number, according to the 2021 census, is about 800 people. Bear in mind, those Sikhs, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and others would not all have voted for Reform. Some would have voted for the Greens and Labour. But even if Matt had won all of those 1,800 votes, he still would have fallen short by about 2,000 votes. So it was always doomed to fail, to pander to sectarian minority concerns. And so Reform were engaging in sectarianism. Farage was trying to court the Muslim vote. Matt was trying to court the Sikh vote. None of them were running with the message that we are for native Brits. We are a party for the British people, and we can actually define who the British people are. They found themselves not only incapable of doing that, but they actively resisted that. Because a couple of days before the election, Matt went to enemy publication Spiked Online. Spiked started as a publication called Living Marxism, and they've repeatedly written hit pieces for years now about me, Harrison Pitt, Stephen Edgington, Nick Dixon, all the people that have gotten this sort of stuff correct and were warning Matt Goodwin not to run a minoritarian pandering campaign. Matt went and gave an interview to Spiked Online's editor Tom Slater, and in it, Slater wrote that Goodwin's opponents have tried to tar him as far-right, with much of the campaign consisting of Goodwin having his more controversial statements thrown back at him, particularly those about the thorny issue of ethnicity. Goodwin has argued that Englishness is primarily a matter of ethnicity, as distinct from Britishness, which he sees as open to those willing to assimilate into British society. This is Suella Braverman's position, by the way, though not a position shared by the rest of Reform. So, Reform's party line is incoherent, but setting that aside, Goodwin insists this isn't about excluding minorities from the national community, contrasting himself with Reform's more vociferous critics on the online, hardcore, ethno-nationalist right. Again, just throwing all the mean names you can out there. It's basically just Regina George saying you can't sit with us. Goodwin responded, "This is probably the dividing line between me and some of the vocal people online. There are clearly lots of people to the right of reform, noisy but largely insignificant in the real world, who view Britishness simply through the lens of race, ethnicity, and ancestry." Slater observes that Goodwin has been attacked on X for campaigning with minority Brits. This has really got his blood up, it seems. Quote, Goodwin says, "I've had British Sikhs canvassing with me. We've had Hong Kongers, British Hindus. There are people to the right of reform who would say, all of those people should be removed from our country. Yet those people have campaigned with me harder than anybody I see complaining about the state of our country. In fact, I would go further. They probably believe in this country a lot more than some of the people to the right of reform who are very good at making noise online, but I've never once seen knock on a door." Oh yeah, that's right. They're more British than me, Matt. No, you absolutely believe that. You 100% believe that. I know you don't, because I've spoken to you for years. I know you think that's absurd. So instead, you're just saying this because you were trying to run a safe campaign, as probably advised by the cowards at Millbank Tower, who said we need to sit there and ritualistically denounce bogeymen of the far right that the BBC will throw at us. But no, they're not more British than me, because they don't have any native British ancestry. That doesn't mean they're bad people. But it does mean that you are willing to call your own friends, people you know, as well as your likely voters, because remember, there was a chap in Gorton and Denton that Aaron Bastani interviewed for Novara Media who replied when asked, who would you like to see as Prime Minister? Rupert Lowe. So that means that, he is online enough to know that Rupert Lowe is a solid politician and share some sympathies with him, so may have stayed at home and not voted for you, considering you insulted him. You were willing to not just call people you know and your friends, but your potential voters a basket of deplorables. How did that work out for Hillary Clinton, Matt? How did that work out for you? Because you were never going to make significant enough inroads to the Muslim community, and you were never going to win over enough minority voters to beat the Greens. The numbers are in. Instead, what you needed to do was galvanise the disenfranchised sofa voters that you wrote about many times in Values, Voice and Virtue or National Populism, so you knew the electoral maths here. You needed to galvanise those people that voted for Brexit, voted for Boris, felt betrayed, so they stayed at home for Keir Starmer, and were hoping that Reform was going to be a party of the forgotten, working-class British majority, but instead decided to hug a Sikh on the Brexit bus. You needed to encourage those people that you were anti-establishment enough to bother them showing up for. And you didn't, because more than half the electorate stayed at home. The Green voters came out in their droves. They won well over 40% of the vote share. Your voters stayed at home, Matt, and it's because you didn't represent them. Instead, you poured scorn on the people that were encouraging you to represent them, not because they wanted to be mean to minorities, but because they correctly assess that this is the way that you win. Instead, Matt decided to talk to Tom Slater about Restore Britain. Tom said, "Is Restore Britain headed down this exclusionist road?" Goodwin said, "From where that particular party has started, which I don't think will be very significant in British politics, it doesn't have anywhere to go. Its entire ecosystem is filled with the wrong kinds of people who hold the wrong kinds of ideas.
I don't care."
The people who are criticising reform from the right, he concludes witheringly, are an assortment of amateurs, egomaniacs, zoomers with very little political experience, and inexperienced ideologues who don't really have any grip on political reality. The way forward for reform, he says, is building and mobilising a broad-based coalition of people who believe in the principles that separate us off from the establishment. Okay, Matt, well, I may have just been a humble zoomer with very little political experience, but it turns out that positioning yourselves as an anti-sectarian party, which means that you don't actually have any one particular constituency in the age of successful sectarianism, means that you are part of the establishment. It means that you and Nigel Farage have the exact same rhetoric on the Gorton and Denton by-election as Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch. Those of sore losers wedded to the Blairite paradigm whose immigration policies produced sectarian ethnic voting, but who are unwilling to engage in it because it makes you feel icky. Because that would mean that you can't have a lucrative career writing online Substacks or giving interviews online to Spiked online or hosting a GB News show, complaining about the problem without ever actually seeking to solve it. But hey, again, it may just be that I'm a Zoomer with zero political experience, which is why I successfully predicted how you might be able to win the election, and you not doing that meant that you lost the election. How's all that political experience working out for you? Also, this point about us just being a purely online phenomenon is ridiculous. Not only because, as I've already pointed out, Matt Goodwin makes his living online, and Spiked is an online publication, but also because the reason Zack Polanski was successful is because he gathered the faithful, as Carl Benjamin has said, on social media. He is copying Zoran Mandani's tactic with the direct-to-camera videos and the economic left-wing populism. And you know how we know that this is successful? Because Zia Yusuf's doing the same thing with his walking and talking videos. So when Nigel Farage brags about his TikTok numbers, it's not a purely online phenomena, it's proof that Reform are rocketing up in the polls and are going to become the next party of government. But when other people engage on online criticism of Reform, then you're very online. You need to get out more. You need to be out in the real world, posting photos of halal pizza shops and African hair salons, like Matt Goodwin instead. It was obvious from this interview ahead of the by-election that Goodwin just didn't get it. Because he said, the question I would have for some people on the right is, what do you think would have happened with Brexit if you'd run a Rupert Lowe-style campaign? It wouldn't have gotten anywhere close to 50%, because we know 1/3 of minority Brits came out and said, no, we want national sovereignty, we want to end mass migration, and we want to put tax-paying, hard-working majorities first. Well, that means 2/3 didn't. What would their version of that campaign have looked like? It would have been a 5% campaign at most. No, Matt, in areas like Gorton and Denton, where Gorton is an ethnic colony, and Denton is a besieged citadel of the native working class, it would have looked like a campaign that spoke to the concerns of the besieged working class at the expense of pandering to sectarian minority groups. It would have looked like the current situation across Britain, detailed in Ed Hussein's book, Among the Mosques. I'm going to read an anecdote for you from Blackburn, and this is a microcosm of other cities that have been blighted by the Pakistani rape gangs, but also sectarian Muslim colonies. In his book, Hussein encounters two Englishmen standing by the side of the road and asks them for directions while he's trying to look for Asda. And he says, I want to ask you something else. I've just prayed at the central mosque and then walked up this road. There are two large mosques in just a short space. How do you feel about that? There are about 30 mosques in Blackburn, says the chubby man. Over there, they're building another one, says a thin chap. That's only been stopped because the houses at the back have collapsed, says the chubby man. They've all caved in, but we're waiting for it to go up. I've always said that once that goes up, I'm going to move away from Blackburn. Too many mosques in Blackburn, mate. Too many, adds the chubby man. Too many, echoes the other. The Asian population of Blackburn, says the thin man. It doesn't warrant that many mosques. Full disclosure, I say. I prayed at the first large mosque, and it was empty at the back. You've got mosques here that'll take 3,000 or 4,000 people, says the chubby man. Why is all that happening, I ask. I don't know, he replies. We've been saying it for years, says the skinny man in his strong northern accent. Doesn't need it, mate. Doesn't need it in Blackburn, nah. It doesn't, nah. They've just got a new Muslim school in Blackburn now. Muslim school for 800 boys. How does it warrant it? We've just had a new academy built for kids here. You said you'll move away, Ed asked, returning to an earlier theme. Where would you move to? I don't know, says the chubby fellow. I'll probably move to Oswaldwhistle, just near Accrington. Oh, I have seen changes, all right. Too many. That's why there's so much division in this town. They've got white areas, there's a place called Mill Hill. People don't pay attention to towns like this. They just don't know. They don't see what goes on. They don't see what goes on. I interrupt by asking the worst things they've seen that outsiders don't hear about. Well, says the thin man, my son's been jumped 5 times. They were all Asian, 5 times. You mean Asian kids, I try to clarify. No, Asian men, he says with emphasis. 18 and 19-year-olds. My lad's only 12. They battered him in broad daylight here. For what, I ask, astonished. They don't look happy at my questions and they both go quiet. For being white, he says, slowly and deliberately. Wrong area. No, Ed says, unable to stop himself. Yes, he says, yes. You get it in Blackburn, mate. You go to certain areas of Blackburn, they're no-go areas. No-go areas, says the larger man. I still can't believe them. Look, this is what the media guys say, but is it really true? That is true, yes. There are no-go areas in Blackburn, mate. Yeah. I'm shocked, Ez says. How can it be no go? So what will happen, he asks. If we go to Whalley Range, like him and me at night time, we're guaranteed to get jumped. We won't walk out of it. We won't walk to the other end of the street. Ed's still looking puzzled. They pick up on his evident disbelief. It's just the way it is in Blackburn. Just the way it is. And Westminster and that, they don't realise. They just see the town centre. Whalley Range is like the Asian community. Mainly Asian, yeah, it's an Asian community. They mean mainly Pakistani Muslim. I have to open up now, so I do. I've walked along here, and there are no pubs. No major chains or brands. All the pubs are shutting, says the chubby chap. There's no diversity. The reason why the pubs are shutting is so many Muslims coming into Blackburn now. There are no whites coming into these places. We call this the Khyber Pass, says the thin man, pointing to the bridge and the roundabout I've just crossed. We always call it the Khyber Pass, we did, because the Asian community and that, yeah, they're on the other side. Was it always like that, I ask? In the past, when the mills were here? No, it were diverse, says the chubby man. People mixed, we were diverse. The young Asian lads, the way they're brought up now, because they've become more westernised, they think, oh yeah, we do what we want. This process is called cocooning, by the way. Ayaan Hirsi Ali describes it as this, where Muslim enclaves sequester themselves and double down on their cultural practices and thereby their in-group preference and out-group vitriol in order to more closely observe Islamic custom and resist temptation, fitna. But being westernised is to be integrated, Ed protests. No, they both say at the same time. They're not integrating. You come along here at night, you get 10 to 16 Asians in groups everywhere, all drinking and smoking weed, and you can't even walk through. If you're a white lad, you can't. They control the drug trade and the businesses in this town. That's all connected to the rape gangs, by the way. It's how they traffic the girls. You don't need to wait, says the thin man. You wait 10 minutes at the bottom of my street, an Asian guy will pull up. You waiting for drugs, gov? They got this. They got that. You'll get everything. How does that make you feel when you can't speak out against crime? Ed says. It's racism against us white people, the men say. Then what happens, Ed asks. Well, that's the thing. I don't think there'll be a white man in this town in 20 years. No, says the thin man in full agreement. What about your kids? Ed asks. The chubby man answers. Well, I've got 4 lads and a girl. I can imagine 2 of the lads staying in Mill Hill. It's a white area. But my son and my daughter, I can see them flying out. I've told them not to live here. As we speak, a Muslim man walks past in an Arab thwab. They look at him. What are you thinking? Ed asks. We're so used to seeing it now, says the thin man. We just call them pyjamas. We don't care if they want to wear that to the mosque, like. They're comfortable, it's traditional, and going to the mosque and all that lot. We don't mind that, but not every day, mate. The chubby man interrupts. Besides, what I don't like, they've got all these mosques, and then they just start praying out loud on the microphones outside. But if we do that, we get pulled up. You're not even allowed your Union Jack flags around here. You're not allowed England flags. No, says the thin man. I haven't seen any, Ed confirms. No, you won't, the thin man insists. Blackburn with Darwin, the council and all that, will threaten you with eviction if you fly the English flag. They say we're racist. A sigh, they fall silent. I sense they have said the unsaid, and I have heard the unheard. We look at each other. I've stopped you, 2 random men, and heard how you feel so strongly about this, Ed said. Yeah, the men said. Yeah, we do. The Green Party represent the Muslim gangs in this story. Reform should have represented the white men who are losing their country to the Muslim gangs, who are colonising their town, who are selling drugs, who are assaulting their children, who are dispossessing them of their only home. And instead, Reform refused to do so, and pandered to Sikhs and Muslims. Unless Reform recognise that they are the party of the 2 English men in this story, who no doubt were involved in Operation Raise the Colours last summer, then they will lose. And humiliatingly for Reform, even the Green Party have noticed this. My evil twin here decided to call Reform out by saying, well, as much as you're saying we're engaging in sectarian voting, releasing campaign ads in Urdu and other subcontinental languages, Reform are appointing Bangladeshi candidates in East London who are running explicitly on Bangladeshi ethnic interest tickets. And they've done the same in the local elections because they're running a Boris Wave migrant who has already told the candidate selection team in his local area that he plans to return to his homeland one day. That's a direct quote. Who wants to go and work in Dubai eventually. They're running him as a local council candidate. So they're running a Boris Wave migrant at the same time that they're promising to repeal indefinite leave to remain to send the Boris Wave home. Now this won't happen, by the way, because the Boris Wave have already qualified for indefinite leave to remain as of this year if they arrived here in 2021. And that means that they can qualify for citizenship within 12 months. So by 2029, a large proportion of the Boris wave will become British citizens, and Nigel Farage has already emphatically said, no, 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 we're not repealing British citizenship, which means that with every party except for Restore Britain, the Boris wave is here to stay. Reform are running them as candidates. So, if the Green Party can point out that you're a hypocrite on sectarianism, then you have no ground to stand on. You are no better than the Labour Party pandering to Muslims. You're no better than the Conservative Party, who stood candidates on Sikh and Hindu manifestos at the last election. Stop engaging in sectarianism altogether, or how about you actually just become a party for the indigenous majority before they become a minority in their own country? But Reform are never going to do that, and they've made their intention to not do that pretty obvious, with Chairman David Bull, who previously said that we are an island of immigrants and that immigration is the lifeblood of this country and always has been, and that trans-identifying men should enter women's prisons. He went on Sky News the morning after the by-election and threw Matt Goodwin straight under the Brexit bus by saying that Matt's suggestion that being British is more than having a British passport is racist, is wrong, and is not Reform Party policy.
Was he the wrong person for this particular
I have to give him
seat?
credit. He was fantastic. He worked so hard. He was out in all weathers for every single day of that campaign. He had a local connection as chairman. I want everyone to have a local connection with the constituency they stand in. He is an academic. He, I think it's fair to say, made some interesting comments, which I have had discussions with him about.
Which ones in particular did you talk to him
Well,
about?
lots of things. For example, about what it means to be British, for example, came up a lot.
Well, he said that you can't be basically black or brown and be British.
I don't think he did quite say that.
What did he say?
This is what the bit I can't quite understand. But the point was...
He said being British is more than a piece of paper. He also said that people who aren't white can't always be English.
Yeah, I didn't understand his reasoning, but the whole point was that it wasn't Reform Party policy anyway. The point is that...
You're stepping away from that idea of...
Sorry, am I?
You're disowning it, yeah, for Reform.
Yes, I am, absolutely. So the point is, if you were born here, if you're British, you hold a British passport, you're British.
So Axel Rudikabana, British, according to David Bull. Imagine running for a party, eating a lot of shit to sit at the head table, direct quote that Matt told me in November when I got banned for Reform. Imagine doing all that only to run in a by-election and then the next morning be disowned, absolutely disowned, by your own party chairman. This is what happens when the price of entry to Reform is betraying your previous party by defecting, or lying in order to appease whatever policy Nigel Farage cooks up when he gets out of bed in the morning or is handed to him by his donors in Dubai and elsewhere. This is what happens when the price of admission to Reform is dishonesty. You get disloyalty if it advantages the respective members of the Reform hierarchy to betray you. And we know the price of admission to Reform is dishonesty because they're all lying about what a British person is. No, you're not just British because you have a passport. No, Sikhs and Hindus from India are not more British than I am just because I didn't deliver leaflets for your campaign, Matt. And bear in mind, if patriots that you knew and have since misrepresented the views of did want to deliver leaflets for your campaign, they would have been banned by David Bull and Zia Yusuf. Because I know I was. That's why lots of people have left Reform and are coalescing around Restore, because Reform decided to betray their base because they thought that there were more votes available by not engaging in substantive representation of the native British majority. Meanwhile, the Green Party successfully pander to ethnic and sectarian religious concerns. Sectarianism is the future, and if you don't play the game, then you lose by default. And the rhetoric of Reform is losing by default because they still refuse to define who the British people are. You can't represent the British people if you cannot define them. And I don't wish to be mean to Andrew Rosendale because he seems like a decent enough chap. But his inability to speak clearly about who the British people are, who is the primary concern of Reform, means that reform writ large are incapable of representing the British people.
Think about the demographic replacement in the UK, where the majority of the native people are going to be a minority by 2063.
So I think we need to look after British interests, and we need to ensure that all of our policies are going to benefit the British people, the British culture, the British way of life, and we should stop pandering to every minority and start looking after the national interest, and that means the people that have fought for this country, that work for this country, that pay their taxes, that are law-abiding and uphold the Christian values of our island nation.
So
thank you very much.
Now look, this is a better answer than most of Reformed leaders have given, but I don't think that Andrew Rosendale is going to be calling for the disbanding of Reform Friends of Israel or Reform Jewish Alliance anytime soon. I don't think he's going to be denouncing Reform candidates who campaign like Matt Goodwin with Sikhs and Hindus. I don't think he's going to tell his leader, Nigel Farage, to stop pandering to the Muslim vote, otherwise Zia Yusuf might call the police on him, as he did to Rupert Lowe. Like, it's just not true that Reform aren't playing sectarian politics. They're just not interested in taking our side. Instead, they are just, and it's a suicidal strategy, trying to capture minority groups that are already in the thrall of Labour, the Conservatives, or the Greens. How about you just seek to represent the British people instead, and actually live up to your potential to be the nativist party? The fact that Restore Britain exists is a recognition that they haven't, they won't, and they don't intend on doing so. And this lack of intention is made most clear by Richard Tice, who previously told Stephen Edgington that demographic replacement by 2063 is not a concern of his because by then he'll be long gone. And this is something that the intrepid young Bob decided to ask him about, and Tice, yet again in completely detached and willfully ignorant fashion, just refuses to answer it, talks past it, deflects, and answers these questions as if he's like an Oblivion NPC that's glitched out and given the wrong responses to the voice prompts.
Excellent, tremendous.
Do you feel like you're going to win this by-election?
Well, fingers crossed, it's very close.
And what do you think about Layla Cunningham's recent statement that Charlie Downs, this Restore spokesperson, is a neo-Nazi?
It's a lovely day in Gorton and Denton, and we're going to win. Fingers crossed.
How are you?
Been better. How about you?
Not bad.
Good to hear. Goodbye.
What do you think about fractions on the right wing? Do you feel like that's going to damage your chances in a national election?
We're going to win here, hopefully, but it's going to be close.
I mean, the bookies have the Green Party at 42%, so I do feel like parachuting a candidate that's in St Albans may have not been your best odds.
Richard, will you be getting gone by the time we're replaced? Will you care?
Yeah, funny enough, in a Sun's interview, you said that demographic replacement won't affect you because by then you'd be dead. Do you think it's sensible for a politician to speak about their mortality and say that you shouldn't have long-term policies to affect this country?
Well, if you look at my British sovereign wealth fund policy, that's a 100-year policy. And it's going to help make Britain more prosperous. You said you'd be getting gone, so you don't care.
Brilliant. It's a 100-year policy that all of the Afghans, Somalians and Pakistanis that then occupy our isle after 2063 can benefit from. Also, as Dan Tubb joked on the Lotus Eaters, what wealth? Like, which companies are going to invest in this? OnlyFans? And I'm not joking about Afghans replacing the English, by the way. This is what Reform are comfortable with doing. This is Danny Kruger's response to Winston Marshall, again, son of Paul Marshall, owner of GB News and ARC, soon to be The Telegraph, also The Spectator and Unheard. So all the publications on the establishment right in Britain that seem to be pretty comfortable with Reform and pushing for a Reform Tory pact. Even Winston Marshall was shocked that Danny Kruger said that Afghans are just as much inheritors of English culture and our country as the Anglo-Saxons.
Perhaps the most striking from your book, which is, the British are bound by something quite other than blood. Ours is a civic, not a racial nationalism, an artificial brotherhood forged by centuries of peaceful enjoyment of the common inheritance to which all newborn citizens, whether ethnic Saxons or Afghans, are equal heirs. Now, this strikes me because of your inclusion of Afghans there, not least because I don't think Afghans have been here for centuries. So Afghans who have been here, it would have been, they're probably first generation, possibly second generation. But you're suggesting that they are equal heirs to those who have been here for 1100, since earlier than England's existence even.
Well, I talk about newborn Afghans being heirs to the civilization that they're born into, and that is correct.
Great value.
I mean, I don't know who my grandfather was. I mean, the idea that we only have value if we can sort of trace our inheritance back to Saxon times, I think is unreal and immoral. Actually, we should be saying, as long as if you are born here, if you are, you're a son or daughter of this country, you are the heir to Alfred and William and Elizabeth and Victoria. The great kings and queens of England. They are the they created the inheritance which you now have. But
let's take for the sake of argument that they came legally.
Okay. Yes. Well, so they came here legally, but if they're asylum seekers, they are not naturalised citizens, and they should be treated humanely, but they do not have the same rights as a Brit.
But if their kids were born here, those kids would?
Yes, those kids would have the right to be British. I think that is right.
And they would be equal heirs to the Saxons, heirs of the
but heirs in the way that you expect your children to grow up respecting the rules of the household.
It doesn't matter if you don't like it or find it immoral, Danny. This wishful thinking is going to get us all killed. No, Afghans are not English. No, Afghans cannot be English. No, they are not as much the heirs of England and the great kings and queens that are replete throughout our history, to Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, the abolition of the slave trade, to Richard the Lionheart and Robin Hood, to Alfred the Great and Athelstan. No, they are not as much heirs as I am, as the English people themselves are. And so, you cannot represent the British public if you can't define a British person. If there is no theory of mind for why Afghans, or Bengalis, or Pakistanis are not voting reform in their droves, then you will lose. If you implicitly concede that demographic change will render it impossible for you to win an election, but then resign yourselves to doing nothing about it, then you will lose. If you say, this is the last election, but then insist that you can change the mind of every Muslim in Britain to vote reform, then it is obvious that you are hypocrites, even to the Green Party, who are accusing you of sectarian ethnic pandering to immigrant groups, and are pretty confident that they're going to one-up you in that. Bottom line, if you don't take your own side, you will lose. And Reform refuse to. Which is why, as things stand, they will lose, and if another party does not exist to surpass them, we will all lose along with them.
We will lose.
The lesson of Gorton and Denton is this. Ethnic sectarian voting is our unfortunate future. Pick a side, and make sure it's your own.